Blake Harrison was always the center of attention. As CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the US, he commanded respect, wealth, and influence. By 35, his life seemed flawless: luxurious mansions, sports cars, and a constant stream of people eager to flatter him. For Blake, life was a game of power and dominance, a game he never lost. One Saturday afternoon, Blake found himself in an unexpected place for someone of his stature, a local McDonald's. It was an ironic choice, a way for him and his friends to play at being ordinary. They gathered at a table in the back, casually chatting while Blake, as usual, led the conversation. "You've done it all, man," Caleb Turner, one of his oldest friends, said, taking a bite of his burger. "Made millions, charmed whoever you wanted, but I bet you can't win this next bet." Blake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I'm listening." Caleb grinned, clearly enjoying the moment. "I bet you can't marry a woman who has absolutely nothing to do with our world, and I'm not talking about models or businesswomen. I mean someone completely ordinary." Blake's smile faltered as the other friends exchanged amused glances. "What do you mean by ordinary?" Caleb pointed discreetly to a waitress cleaning nearby. "I mean her," he said. "That single mom. The waitress here at McDonald's. I bet you can't win her over and marry someone like her. Let's see you bring her into your world." Blake followed Caleb's gaze. The waitress in question was Rachel Miller, a 28-year-old who had worked at McDonald's for years to support her 5-year-old daughter, Chloe. Rachel was quiet and hardworking, never letting the stress of difficult customers or the exhaustion of single motherhood get to her. To most people in Blake's circle, she would have been invisible. "You want me to marry the waitress?" Blake asked, half amused, half skeptical. "Exactly," Caleb said, his eyes gleaming. "And if you pull it off, I'll give you $2 million. No tricks, no contracts. It has to be a real marriage." Blake's first thought was that $2 million was a drop in the bucket, but the challenge itself sparked his curiosity. He never turned down a bet, especially one that involved winning. And Rachel, with her simple, far-removed life, seemed like the perfect opportunity for yet another conquest. $2 million? Blake smiled, raising his soda. "This will be a piece of cake. Get the check ready, Caleb, I'm going to win." His friends laughed, confident they were witnessing the beginning of another triumph for the unflappable Blake Harrison. But beneath his usual bravado, Blake felt a flicker of genuine excitement. Rachel would be a different kind of challenge, and he liked a good challenge. As Rachel moved around the restaurant, clearing tables, Blake watched her more closely. Her light brown hair was tied in a ponytail, and she wore no makeup. But it was something in her eyes. An odd mixture of wariness and quiet strength that intrigued him. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a woman who had learned how to survive in the real world. When she came over to clear a few cups from his table, Blake decided it was time to make his move. "Rachel, right?" he asked casually. She glanced at him briefly, her expression neutral. "Yes. Can I help you with something?" "Call me Blake," he said with a confident smile. "I don't think you've served me before." Rachel blinked, surprised. "I've worked here for months. You probably didn't notice." Blake chuckled, shaking his head. "Probably not, but that changes today. How about we grab a coffee sometime?" She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Sorry, I'm working." Blake didn't let up. "Not now, of course, but you must get a day off, right? We could talk a little." Rachel studied him for a long moment before answering, "I need to get back to work." With that, she turned and walked away. Blake sat back in his chair, a wave of frustration rolling over him. He wasn't used to being dismissed so easily. She hadn't reacted the way he expected, but that only made Blake more determined. Rachel wasn't like the other women he was used to winning over with charm and a few well-placed words. There was something about her resistance that intrigued him, and Blake never shied away from a challenge. As Rachel walked by, collecting more empty cups and tossing them in the trash, Blake watched her closely. "I'm persistent, Rachel. You'll see. I'll keep asking until you say yes." She gave him a polite smile, completely unaffected by his charm. "Good luck with that." Her calm response only fueled his determination. What had started as a simple bet among friends now felt personal. Blake Harrison always got what he wanted, and he wasn't about to lose to a waitress. He was going to win Rachel, just like he had won every bet before. As Caleb and the others finished their meals, Blake stole one last glance at Rachel before leaving. He knew that the next time he saw her, he'd be more direct. One thing was certain: no one resisted Blake Harrison for long, and Rachel Miller wouldn't be the exception. Blake had never backed down from a challenge, especially after Caleb raised the bet to $2 million. This wasn't about money, it was about pride. He was determined to get Rachel to accept his invitation and ultimately to marry him. With each passing day, Blake's focus on the goal sharpened. Deep down, he knew the bet was shallow, but the idea of being rejected bruised his ego more than anything. Let's have some fun with those who only read the comments. They won't get it. Type McDonald's in the comments. Only those who've made it this far will understand. The following Tuesday, Blake returned to McDonald's at the same time. He watched Rachel, as always, moving between tables with quiet efficiency. She was quick, professional, her focus unwavering. Something about her seriousness captivated him. It was exactly what set her apart from the women he usually met. Rachel seemed strong, grounded, and completely uninterested in the games he typically played. Blake was accustomed to women vying for his attention, but Rachel was indifferent. It was refreshing. When Rachel approached his table to take his order, Blake couldn't resist. "Hey Rachel, I thought you might be expecting me." She raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Didn't know you came here so often." "Well, I think I'll start coming more often," he said, his tone playful. "You know, great service and all." Rachel shot him a skeptical look, jotting down his order. But before she could walk away, Blake decided to press on. "How about that coffee? Just to get to know each other a little better." She studied him for a moment, clearly irritated by his persistence, but took a deep breath. "Look, I appreciate the offer, but I'm really busy. My life doesn't leave room for casual meetups." Blake realized that his usual approach might be too casual for her. Time to switch tactics. He softened his tone. "I get it. You're busy. I promise I'm not here to make things harder for you. I just want to get to know you better." Rachel hesitated, her guard still up, but something in Blake's steady gaze seemed to make her pause. Finally, she let out a small sigh and relented. "Okay, Blake, but it'll be a quick coffee. I don't have time for much more than that." It was a small victory, but for Blake, it was enough. All he needed was an opening, and now he had one. That same afternoon, they met at a nearby cafe. Rachel arrived on time, still in her work uniform, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. Blake, on the other hand, was completely at ease. They sat in the back, away from the other customers, and he watched as she glanced at the menu with little enthusiasm. "So Rachel," he began, trying to sound friendly, "what's your life like? How long have you worked at McDonald's?" She shrugged, keeping her tone cool and reserved. "A few years. It's how I support my daughter, Chloe. I work a lot, but it's what I can do for now." Blake nodded, feeling oddly out of place. For the first time, he was having a conversation that wasn't about luxury vacations or the stock market. It was about survival, and Rachel's reality was so different from his own. "For me," he said, "work is mostly about meetings and strategy. You know, I'm the CEO of a tech company. It's a bit of a different lifestyle." Rachel didn't react as he expected. She just nodded as though she had already guessed as much. "I thought so. Why was I surprised by your invitation? People like you don't usually mix with people like me." Rachel's honesty struck a nerve, and it bothered him more than he expected. "Why do you say that? Do you think everyone's the same?" Blake asked, his voice a little shaken for the first time. Rachel met his gaze without flinching. "It's not that I think everyone's the same," she said, her voice steady. "I just don't understand why a wealthy, successful man like you would be interested in someone like me. You could have anyone from your circle." Blake felt cornered. He couldn't explain the bet, so he gave her the only answer he could think of. "Maybe that's exactly what fascinates me about you, Rachel. You're not from my world, and that's rare for me." Rachel sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, Blake, I'll be honest. My daughter is my priority. She means everything to me. I'm here because I believe you're being genuine, but I don't have time for games." He nodded, something inside him shifting. As committed as he was to the bet, there was something about Rachel that intrigued him. She was real, straightforward, and unlike anyone he had ever met. "I understand, Rachel," he said softly. I promise you, no games here. She studied him for a long moment, then finished her coffee and stood up. Well, it was a quick coffee, as I said. Blake smiled, undeterred. How about we do this again sometime? Maybe a lighter conversation next time? She paused, weighing the offer. After a moment, she gave a small nod. Maybe. As she walked away, Blake stayed behind, watching her slip through the cafe doors. He had taken the first step, and now his curiosity about her only deepened. Blake was used to achieving his goals quickly, but with Rachel Miller, he felt the same urgency to understand her. After that brief coffee, her image and the sincere words about her daughter lingered in his mind. The bet with Caleb was still there, but now it felt less like a motivator and more like a distant echo. Something inside him was pushing him to get to know Rachel, to explore this unexpected connection. In the weeks that followed, Blake found himself returning to McDonald's more often. He kept his approach casual, not wanting to overwhelm her, but he seized every opportunity to chat. Slowly, Rachel started getting used to his presence, and their conversations grew more personal, revealing glimpses of their lives beyond the surface. One afternoon, Blake realized it was time to escalate things. He knew that if he continued with casual chats and coffee dates, Rachel would never take him seriously. He needed to make a bold move, something that would show her he was genuinely interested. That calm afternoon at McDonald's, as Rachel arranged trays behind the counter, Blake decided it was time. "Rachel," he began, his voice careful but sincere. "I've been thinking a lot about us. I know this might sound sudden, but what do you think about taking this seriously?" She blinked, surprised, her brow furrowing. Taking what seriously? Blake drew in a steady breath, determined to be direct. "Marriage." Rachel laughed, her shock evident. "Are you serious? I barely know you." Blake gave her a small, reassuring smile, doing his best to remain composed. "I know it sounds crazy," he admitted, "but I feel like we have something special, something I've never felt with anyone else. Maybe it's because you're not from my world. Maybe it's because I see something real in you. Someone who truly lives a purposeful life." She shook her head, still in disbelief. "Are you really suggesting marriage with someone you hardly know? What kind of reality is that?" Blake felt the weight of her skepticism and knew he had to be more convincing. "I'm not joking, Rachel. I know I come from a very different world, and I realize this might sound absurd. But I want to give you and Chloe a better life. That's why I'm here." Rachel took a deep breath, her mind torn. She wanted to reject him, to brush him off as just another wealthy man playing a game. But a strange pull, an attraction she couldn't explain, held her back. It was hard to believe, but something in him felt different. Rachel still couldn't quite believe it. The idea that someone like Blake, with his lavish lifestyle, would be genuinely interested in her seemed almost impossible. But as she met his gaze, a flicker of hope stirred within her. "I'm not expecting an answer right now," Blake said, sensing her hesitation. "Just think it over. I don't want to pressure you, but I truly believe we could make this work." Rachel studied him, her mind racing, trying to decipher the sincerity behind his words. "I'll think about it," she finally replied, her voice soft but firm, before she turned back to her work, her confusion still lingering. The following days were filled with doubt and reflection for Rachel. She couldn't stop questioning Blake's proposal. After all, he was a man from a world she didn't understand, while her reality, struggling as a single mother and waitress, seemed worlds apart from the life he was offering. But the idea of marrying him, and what that could mean for her daughter Chloe, stirred something deep inside her. The thought of a future she could never provide on her own was tempting, even if it seemed improbable. A week later, Blake appeared again at McDonald's. He waited patiently for Rachel to finish her shift, and when she emerged, he called out to her, his smile a mix of confidence and nervousness. "Rachel, have you thought about what I asked?" She paused, taking a deep breath, her expression serious. "Do you really think this could work, Blake? We're from completely different worlds. I'm a waitress with a young daughter. My priority is her, and always will be. I'm not here for games." Blake nodded, a quiet determination in his eyes. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. As he opened it, the simple but elegant ring sparkled under the moonlight. He had chosen it carefully, nothing too flashy, something that would reflect sincerity without intimidating her. "Rachel, I'm serious," he said, holding the ring between his fingers. "I want you to see this as an opportunity for us to build something real. We could give Chloe a better life, and if you say yes, I promise I will never let you down." Rachel's heart began to race. The proposal felt almost surreal, but Blake's unwavering sincerity made her believe, even if just for a moment, that this was real. "Why me, Blake?" she asked, her voice still thick with disbelief. "With all your money and your world, why are you asking me this?" Blake's smile was soft, almost rueful, as he considered the truth he couldn't fully explain himself. "Because you're unlike anyone I've ever met. For the first time, I see something real, something that matters." Rachel fell silent, her gaze fixed on the ring, her thoughts swirling. "This feels so unreal, but I can't ignore that I have a daughter to think about. Maybe I'm being foolish, but for Chloe's sake, I'll accept." Blake moved closer, gently slipping the ring onto her finger. "I promise, I'll make this worth it, Rachel." Still in shock at her own decision, Rachel exhaled slowly. "All right, Blake, I'm trusting you with this." Blake smiled, relieved, a sense of certainty flooding through him. He was one step closer to winning the bet. For Rachel Miller, accepting Blake Harrison's proposal felt surreal, but necessary. Since becoming a mother, every decision she had made had been for Chloe's well-being. And now, by taking this bold step, her goal was clear: to secure a better future for her daughter. The transition into this new life happened quickly. Blake took charge with his usual efficiency, arranging for Rachel and Chloe to move into his mansion. The house was grand, with soaring ceilings, luxurious furniture, and everything Rachel had never imagined. Every corner radiated wealth, but to her, it felt cold and impersonal. She struggled to adjust, as the differences between their worlds were impossible to ignore. In those first days, she often felt like a guest in a life that didn't belong to her. Blake, though considerate, maintained a careful distance. He seemed genuinely interested in making her feel at home, but his busy schedule, filled with endless meetings and responsibilities, kept him from forming a deeper connection. Their first dinner at the mansion only emphasized the divide between their worlds. They sat at a long dining table, with Blake at the head, Rachel a few seats away, and Chloe in between them. Blake watched Chloe, his gaze a mixture of curiosity and unease. The little girl seemed mesmerized by the silver cutlery and the sparkling crystal glasses. "Do you like it here, Chloe?" Blake asked, attempting to make conversation. Chloe nodded shyly. "Yes, it's big, like a princess's house." Rachel smiled at her daughter, trying to keep her grounded. "It sure is, sweetie, but remember, this is just a place for us to live. Our life is still the same." Blake sensed the caution in Rachel's voice, wondering if she felt out of place. He attempted to lighten the mood by sharing a childhood story about how he once got lost in one of his family's sprawling estates. But despite his efforts, Rachel remained reserved, as though she was still figuring out her place in this new world. As the days turned into weeks, Rachel gradually learned more about Blake's life. He was a man consumed by his work, surrounded by endless meetings and powerful connections. Meanwhile, Rachel spent most of her time caring for Chloe, managing her schoolwork, and trying to settle into the unfamiliar house. Blake tried to engage with Rachel and Chloe when he could, carving out time between his busy schedule. Yet his presence often felt distant. He asked about Chloe's daily routine and tried to participate in family activities, but the gap between their lives seemed insurmountable. One afternoon, as Rachel was helping Chloe with her homework, Blake walked into the living room and stood silently for a moment, watching them. The bond between mother and daughter was so simple, so natural, and so genuine, something he had never truly experienced. "Need any help?" Blake asked, his voice awkward but sincere. Rachel looked up, a bit surprised. "You know anything about school homework?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Maybe not, but I can give it a try." Rachel smiled, and for the first time, Blake felt like he was truly connecting with her. He sat down next to them, attempting to join in with Chloe's homework. The little girl giggled at his mistakes as she answered the questions. That small, light-hearted moment felt like a bridge between their very different worlds. But even with this small progress, Rachel remained skeptical of Blake's intentions. She knew their marriage hadn't started in the most conventional way, and something still felt unsaid between them. Blake, however, was beginning to experience an internal shift he hadn't anticipated. At first, it had all been about pride, a bet, a challenge to prove he could win. But now, in the presence of Rachel and Chloe, he found himself questioning the real purpose of it all. That same night, as Blake was preparing for bed, he noticed Rachel sitting on the edge of the bed, lost in thought. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice soft and cautious. She sighed, meeting his gaze. "Blake, I think we need to understand what exactly we're doing here. We're not a normal couple. We don't have a history together, and even though you've been thoughtful, I feel like we're just trying to fit into something that might not work." Blake sat beside her, his expression serious. "I understand, Rachel, but would you believe me if I said I'm trying to figure this out too? I want this to work. Even though we didn't start off the best way, we can still build something real together." Rachel studied him in silence. She wasn't sure if she could trust his words. Everything about Blake seemed too perfect, and his intentions had always been unclear. Yet, despite her doubts, she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real. Perhaps over time, he could come to appreciate the simple life she held so dear. "For now, I think we can just try," she said with a sigh. "But I need you to be honest with me, Blake. If this isn't real, if this is just some experiment, then I'd rather end it now." Blake nodded, his expression earnest. "It's real, Rachel. I promise you." His words brought her a measure of peace, though she still felt uncertain. Building a life together was proving to be far more complicated than she had imagined. Still, in that moment, she decided to give Blake, and herself, a chance. As the weeks passed, something unexpected began to change within Blake Harrison. Living with Rachel and Chloe was affecting him in ways he hadn't anticipated. At first, this marriage had been nothing more than a bet, a challenge to prove he could win. But the more time he spent with Rachel and her daughter, the more he found himself transformed. Chloe's bright smile and the simplicity with which Rachel approached life stirred something inside him. It was an admiration that went far deeper than anything he had ever experienced. Material accomplishments, once so important, now seemed hollow compared to the authenticity and devotion he saw in Rachel's life. Rachel's daily acts of care for her daughter and the way she managed everything at home revealed a strength Blake had never encountered within his social circle. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Blake realized he was opening up to Rachel in a way he never had before. He spoke about his childhood, the weight of family expectations, and the pressure of being a young CEO. Rachel listened with an attentiveness that made him feel like, for the first time, he didn't have to prove anything, he could simply be himself. "I don't think I've ever had anyone I could really talk to about these things," Blake admitted, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. Rachel smiled softly, her eyes warm. "Sometimes, Blake, all you need is someone who will listen, someone who doesn't expect anything in return." Her words hit him hard. Blake realized how accustomed he had become to relationships built on transactional exchanges, where favors, status, or power were always at the center. But with Rachel, things were different. She didn't expect anything from him except honesty, and that made him feel completely disarmed. As the weeks passed, Blake's transformation deepened. He found himself seeking out more opportunities to spend time with Rachel and Chloe, savoring the small moments in daily life he would have once overlooked. One weekend, he surprised them with a trip to the park, something he had once seen as ordinary, but which turned into an exciting adventure for Chloe. She ran across the grass, laughing and shouting as Blake struggled to keep up. Rachel watched them, smiling warmly, and in that moment, Blake found himself caught up in the simple joy of it all. He had never felt so lighthearted. Deep down, he began questioning the real reason for their marriage. That initial bet no longer held weight, and he realized that he wasn't there for money or pride anymore. He was there because he felt something real. During the outing, Blake had a heartfelt conversation with Rachel while Chloe played nearby. "Rachel, I know we started this in a strange way, but I'm trying to figure out what's happening to me," Blake confessed. She looked at him, curiosity in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I never imagined I'd feel so connected," he said, glancing away. "Spending time with you and Chloe has become the best part of my day. It sounds crazy, but you've both made me see life differently." Rachel smiled, a little surprised but cautious. "I know our beginning was complicated, Blake, but I feel like there's something special here too. But we need to be honest with each other. If this isn't real, I'd rather not continue." Blake took her hand in his, looking into her eyes with sincerity. "It's real, Rachel. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As the days turned into months, Blake's transformation became even more apparent. He distanced himself from the friends who had pushed him into the bet and started rearranging his work schedule to spend more time at home. Caleb and the others began to notice the changes, and soon they confronted him about it. One evening during dinner, Caleb spoke up. "Blake, what's going on with you? You're pulling away from everyone. You're changing completely." Blake exhaled deeply, tired of the constant questioning. "I think I'm finally realizing what really matters." Caleb chuckled disbelievingly. "Is this all because of the bet? I thought it was just some joke." Blake's irritation flared. "I bet you find it funny, but it's not a joke anymore. I want things to work with Rachel." Caleb studied him for a long moment. "So it's serious then?" Blake nodded firmly. "Yes, it's serious. And if you can't understand that, maybe you should focus on your own life." The conversation ended there, and that night, Blake realized that his friendship with Caleb was over. He knew he couldn't continue living in the same circles, and cutting ties with that social group felt like severing the last connection to a life he no longer wanted. He understood now that he wanted an authentic life with Rachel and Chloe, even if it meant walking away from everything he had known. When Blake arrived home that evening, Rachel immediately noticed something was off. As they sat together in the living room, he opened up about the sense of disconnection he was feeling, how everything he once valued seemed to be slipping away. "I feel like I'm drifting away from everyone," he said with a sigh. "Like everything I used to care about doesn't matter anymore." Rachel placed her hand over his, her voice gentle. "Maybe you're just finding something more real, Blake. Sometimes we need to get lost to find ourselves." Her words were the final push Blake needed to commit fully to the life he now wanted, one that was real, grounded in love, and free from the distractions of his old world. For the first time, Blake was ready to leave everything behind and move forward with Rachel. He realized that with her, he had found not only true love but also a way of life that fulfilled him in ways he had never imagined. The months he spent with Rachel and Chloe had brought him countless revelations. The transformation was clear, not just in his actions, but in the way he viewed the world around him. He spent more time at home, focused on simple moments, and distanced himself from the social circles he once thought essential. But one autumn morning, an unexpected discovery sent everything crashing back, stirring memories Blake had tried to bury. He was in his home office, going over some contracts, when an old document caught his eye. It was a news article about a past acquisition, an old factory his company had shut down years ago. As he looked at the date, memories flooded back. He remembered making the call to close the factory, a decision aimed at cutting costs and increasing profits. At the time, it had seemed like just another business move, but for many, it had changed everything. Unable to shake the feeling, Blake dug deeper into the aftermath of the factory's closure. He learned that hundreds of employees had lost their jobs. The town where the factory was located had suffered economically, forcing many families to start over. Back then, he had never considered the human cost, only the effect on profits. But as he read the details of the report and saw the town's decline, a chilling truth hit him. The factory was in Rachel's hometown. His hands shook as he pieced together the story. He realized with growing dread that his decision had directly impacted her life. This was why Rachel had struggled, why she had ended up working at McDonald's, raising Chloe alone. Even though it wasn't intentional, he had been the cause of her suffering. The revelation rocked him to his core, and he spent the rest of the day lost in guilt and regret. The thought that he was responsible, even in part, for Rachel and Chloe's hardship consumed him. But how could he tell her? How could he admit that he had been the one to bring them so much pain? The days that followed were torturous. Blake found himself becoming more distant, the weight of his secret driving a wedge between him and Rachel. She noticed the change, his quietness, his preoccupation, but he kept his emotional turmoil hidden, terrified of how she might react. Yet, deep down, he knew he couldn't keep the truth from her forever. Finally, one quiet evening, after Chloe had gone to bed, Blake knew the time had come to tell her everything. The calm atmosphere of the living room seemed to amplify the tension, but he had to speak. "Rachel," he began, his voice careful, "I need to talk to you about something important, something from my past." Rachel, sensing the seriousness in his tone, looked at him concerned. "What is it, Blake? Did something happen?" Blake took a deep breath, and the words began to spill out. "Do you remember the factory you worked at before we met? The one that was shut down?" Rachel's face clouded with sadness at the mention of that difficult time. "Yes, I remember it. It was a really hard time. I was pregnant with Chloe, and I had to face it all on my own." Blake turned away, shame creeping over him. "Rachel, it was me. I'm the one who ordered the factory to close." The words hung heavily in the air, and Rachel's expression shifted from confusion to shock. She blinked, struggling to process what he had just said. Her face contorted into a mix of disbelief and hurt. "You did that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," Blake replied, his voice barely above a whisper, full of guilt. "At the time, it was just a business decision. I was focused on profits, and I never considered how it would affect people." He reached out, his voice breaking. "Rachel, I'm so sorry. If I had known, if I had understood how it would impact you, I would never have made that choice." Rachel slowly pulled back, as if the weight of his confession had physically drained her. Every struggle, every sleepless night she had fought to support her daughter and hold on to her dignity now felt tight to him. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. She took a slow, shaky breath, tears brimming in her eyes. "So, all of this, everything we've been through, you're the reason I ended up in that situation." Her voice was low, barely contained. "The reason I had to work as a waitress, struggling to raise Chloe alone? And now what, Blake? Do you expect me to just forget all of it?" Her words cut through him like a knife, and he knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same. He tried to move closer, but she took a step back, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and sorrow. "Rachel, I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to make things right. I need you to forgive me." "Forgive you?" She let out a bitter laugh. "How can I forgive the man who ruined my life, my stability, and then shows up expecting to be some kind of hero? This is selfish, Blake. I don't know if I can forgive you for that." Blake winced at her words, the pain sharp and raw. He knew he deserved every bit of it. His past had come back to haunt him, and now he had to pay the price. He watched as she stood up and walked toward the bedroom, each step heavy with resentment. "Rachel," he called, his voice trembling, "I would do anything to make this right. You and Chloe matter to me more than you know. I don't want to lose you." She paused, turning to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Blake, you didn't win us over with nice words or empty promises. I stayed because I thought you were genuine, but now I see that maybe all of this was just another one of your business deals." Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Blake standing in the living room, suffocating under the weight of his guilt. He knew words were useless now. If he wanted to rebuild the trust he had shattered, it wouldn't be through promises or apologies, but through actions, real, meaningful actions. The revelation about the factory's closure had left a chasm between them. The tension was unbearable. Rachel could hardly bear to look at him. And their conversations, once filled with warmth and laughter, were now reduced to cold exchanges marked by silence and hurt. Blake felt as though he were drowning in the disappointment he saw in Rachel's eyes every time she glanced his way. The next morning, Rachel was still reeling, her emotions a storm she struggled to hide for Chloe's sake. She kept her composure in front of her daughter, but the anger and betrayal festered inside her. How could she forget that Blake's actions had caused her years of hardship? How could she let go of the weight of the struggles she'd endured because of him? What was left of their relationship now but a cruel irony? Blake, too, was visibly shaken. He tried again and again to reach her, but every attempt was met with the invisible barrier she had put up between them. He knew he had to give her space, time to process. But in the meantime, he promised himself that he would find a way to make things right, not through words, but through actions that proved his commitment to change. A few days later, during dinner, Blake mustered the courage to speak more directly. His voice was unsteady as he said, "Rachel, I know I've hurt you, and I understand if you can't forgive me. But will you give me a chance to show you that I've changed? She looked at him, her eyes cold, filled with both pain and indignation. "You want a chance? Blake, you took everything from me, and now you want a chance to prove you're a good person. Don't you think that's a little convenient?" Blake took a deep breath, fighting the urge to give up. "I know you're right to be angry, and I deserve every bit of it. But Rachel, since we met, I've changed. I want to be better for you, for Chloe. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your forgiveness." Rachel shook her head, her expression a mix of frustration and defeat. "It's too late for that, Blake. I let you into my life and my daughter's life because I thought you were different. But in the end, you're just like everyone else I've ever known." With that, she stood up and walked away, leaving Blake alone at the table, crushed under the weight of his guilt. He knew he couldn't fix things with words. He had to show her, through his actions, that he was serious about making amends. In the days that followed, Blake made a decision. He began searching for those who, like Rachel, had been affected by the factory's closure. He traveled to the small town where the factory once stood, meeting with former employees and listening to their stories, learning about their struggles and the hardships they'd faced since the factory had shut down. They had faced it. Confronting the consequences of his impersonal decisions was painful, but Blake knew he had no choice but to accept the reality he had created. After hearing dozens of heart-wrenching stories, he made a decision. He would establish a support fund for the factory's former employees. He set aside a significant portion of his wealth to help their families and create new opportunities for them. Blake knew that no amount of money could undo the damage, but it was a first step towards showing he was genuinely committed to change. When Blake returned home, Rachel continued to avoid him, but he was determined to speak with her. One evening, after Rachel finished putting Chloe to bed, Blake waited for her in the living room. As soon as she entered, he called out to her, his voice steady but calm. "Rachel, I know you're hurt, but I need to tell you what I've been doing. I've been trying to make things right." She folded her arms, a skeptical expression crossing her face. "And how exactly do you plan to fix the past, Blake? With money? That won't erase what you did." "I know it won't," he replied, keeping his composure. "But I went there. I spoke to the former employees. I listened to their stories, and I'm setting up a fund to help them rebuild their lives. I know this doesn't undo the past, but it's my way of trying to make up for the pain I caused." Rachel watched him in silence, her gaze searching his face. There was sincerity in his words, a commitment that surprised her. The wound was still fresh, but for a brief moment, she saw a glimpse of genuine remorse in Blake's eyes. As much as she wanted to stay angry, his effort to right his wrongs started to chip away at her resentment, leaving behind a quiet uncertainty. That night, as Blake stayed in the living room, Rachel returned to the bedroom, her heart torn in two. She couldn't forgive him yet, but she also couldn't ignore the sincerity of his actions. The man standing before her seemed different from the one who had shut down the factory, yet the weight of the past still hung between them, a heavy barrier she wasn't sure she could overcome. The next day, Rachel decided to talk to him again. She found him in his office, absorbed in some notes. She hesitated before speaking, but she knew she needed answers. "Blake," she began, catching his attention. "I heard what you said about the support fund. I know you're trying to make things right, but it's still hard for me to understand." Blake looked at her, his expression serious. "Rachel, I know I may never deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know I'll do whatever it takes. I'm willing to change my whole life if that's what it takes to build something real between us." Rachel watched him in silence, absorbing every word. Though the pain hadn't disappeared, she saw a different man standing before her, one who was genuinely trying to make amends. Maybe this Blake really was changing. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Blake," she said softly, her voice uncertain. "But maybe we can see what happens." Her cautious words gave Blake a glimmer of hope. He knew the road ahead would be long, and earning her forgiveness wouldn't be easy. But he was willing to face any challenge to prove he deserved a second chance. Before they could continue their conversation, the office door suddenly burst open, and Caleb walked in with his trademark sarcastic grin. "Oh, so you two are still here, cozy together." Blake frowned, surprised by the interruption. "Caleb, now's not a good time." Caleb ignored the tension in the room and turned to Rachel, a gleam of amusement in his eyes. "So Rachel, did Blake tell you about the big bet?" Rachel looked confused, turning to Blake, who immediately felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. "Caleb, stop," Blake said sharply. But Caleb only laughed, continuing as if he hadn't heard him. "You see, Blake and I bet a small fortune on whether he could marry you. $2 million, actually. Didn't he tell you? What a shame. I really thought you two were becoming a real couple." Rachel's face shifted from confusion to a mixture of shock and pain. She stepped back, feeling as though the ground had collapsed beneath her. Her eyes locked on Blake's, searching for him to deny it, but his silence confirmed the truth. "Blake, is that true?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She asked, her voice trembling, "Rachel, it wasn't supposed to be like this. At first it was a bet, but I changed. I started to care, really care." He tried to explain, but his words felt hollow. She stepped back, her gaze devastated. "First, you destroyed my life with that factory, and now I find out our marriage was just a bet." Rachel turned and left the room, tears streaming down her face. Blake stood there frozen, knowing that in that moment he might have lost everything he had, everything he'd ever wanted, because of his own lies. Rachel walked out of the mansion, her heart shattered. Caleb's revelation had been the final blow, adding to the well of pain and betrayal she'd already felt. Every moment spent with Blake now seemed like it had been built on a lie. Not only had he ruined her past, but he had deceived her again, promising love and change, while their marriage had been nothing more than a game, a bet for his entertainment and pride. Blake stood by helplessly as Rachel disappeared into the night, each step she took echoing his failure. He wanted to chase after her, to explain, to tell her how much he had changed, and that the bet had meant nothing once he got to know her. But the words felt weak, insufficient to undo the brutal truth she had just uncovered. In the days that followed, Rachel kept her distance, ignoring every attempt Blake made to contact her. She needed time to process, to come to terms with how she had trusted someone who had never truly earned it. Her heart, still raw from the factory's closure, now carried the bitterness of knowing that every gesture of affection from Blake could have been nothing more than a piece of the bet. Meanwhile, Blake was crushed. The mansion, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a hollow shell. Every corner echoed with the absence of Rachel and Chloe. Every message he left on Rachel's phone went unanswered. He knew that words alone would never be enough. He needed to do something far more meaningful to reach her. Determined to win her back, Blake searched for a way to prove that his feelings were real. Instead of relying on money or status, he chose to give up the one thing that had always defined him, his company. He realized that, to deserve a second chance with Rachel and Chloe, he had to break free from everything that tethered him to the man he had been. He spent days in tense negotiations with investors and advisors, fielding questions and dealing with immense pressure, but he stood firm. Finally, when the deals were signed, he was no longer Blake Kingston, the CEO. He was just Blake, no company, no status. He wanted to show Rachel that he no longer needed power or wealth to be happy, that he was willing to start over with her without any ties to his former life. With the papers signed, Blake made his way to a friend's house, where he knew Rachel and Chloe were staying. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, unsure if Rachel would even want to see him. He waited nervously, knowing that his future, whatever it looked like, hinged on her response. Finally, she appeared at the door. Her face was marked by exhaustion and distrust, her eyes wary as she looked at him. "Rachel, I know you may not believe me, but I came to tell you something important." Blake started, unable to meet her eyes. "I sold the company, the place where it all began, where I made the decision to shut down the factory. I'm no longer part of it." She looked at him in shock, hesitant. "Blake, I don't understand. What does this change? Do you think that by getting rid of everything, the lies will just disappear?" "No, Rachel," he said, his voice shaking. "I know this doesn't erase what I did, but I realized I couldn't be with you while still tied to that life. I want you to know that my priority now is you and Chloe. I'm willing to build something real, something clean, even if I have to start from scratch." Rachel stood there, her heart torn between doubt and the smallest glimmer of hope. She took a deep breath, struggling to keep her emotions in check. You had every opportunity to be honest from the start. Every promise, every word of affection feels empty now. Blake nodded, swallowing the sting of her words. I know I may never deserve your forgiveness, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to regain your trust. Believe me, Rachel, I've changed, and this change is for you, for Chloe, because I understand what really matters. She looked at him, her silence heavy with indecision. Part of Rachel still loved him, but the betrayal was a burden too heavy to bear. She needed time. Time to decide if she could ever trust him again. Time to figure out if she could open her heart to him once more. That night, after their long conversation, Rachel went back inside, leaving Blake standing in the quiet of the night, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. He knew he had done all he could up until that moment. Now, the decision rested solely with Rachel and her ability to forgive. In the days that followed, Blake respected her space, sending only occasional messages. He didn't push for a response. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his life with the values Rachel had taught him: simplicity, empathy, and honesty. Weeks passed, and finally, Rachel reached out. She agreed to meet him for one last conversation. As they sat together, Rachel looked at him with a quiet intensity and spoke softly, "I won't pretend that what you didn't hurt me. I know you're trying, Blake, and I see that you've changed. But for me, rebuilding that trust will be a long and difficult process." "I understand," Blake replied, his voice steady. "I'm willing to wait as long as it takes, because, for the first time, I feel like I've found something real, and I won't give up on it." Rachel nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Despite everything, she decided to give the man Blake was becoming a chance, not for the things he had, but for who he was now, showing he could change. Rachel felt torn between the love she still had for Blake and the weight of the betrayal he had caused. She wanted to believe in him, but rebuilding trust wouldn't be easy. Blake had shown patience and sincerity, but Rachel knew actions spoke louder than words. Every step they took forward would be fragile, and any mistake could undo their progress. Blake knew he couldn't rush the process. He kept in touch, quietly taking care of Rachel and Chloe's needs, showing consistent, genuine concern for both of them. Rachel noticed, but the shadows of the past, of the bet, the lies, still haunted her. Deep down, she feared that all of this was temporary, just another empty promise Blake wouldn't be able to keep. A few weeks later, Blake invited Rachel and Chloe to a park he had discovered near the city. He planned a simple picnic with food he had prepared himself, something he knew Rachel would appreciate. When they arrived, Rachel was struck by the simplicity of the moment, so different from the extravagant lifestyle she had once known with Blake. Seeing this new, more human side of him gave her a fresh perspective. For a brief moment, she felt light, almost forgetting the scars. As Chloe ran and played with the ball, Blake and Rachel sat on a bench, quietly watching her. "Thank you for coming," Blake said, breaking the silence. "I know you're being patient with me." Rachel smiled lightly, still cautious. "I'm just trying to understand what's really changed, Blake. But I have to admit, since you got rid of the company, I've seen a side of you I didn't know before." Blake nodded, his gaze fixed on Chloe. "I realized that world, with all the wealth and power games, didn't bring me happiness. You and Chloe, you brought something real into my life. I've come to understand that I need so much less to be happy." Rachel listened, and gradually, the weight of her hurt began to lighten. The authenticity in Blake's words was unmistakable, and she started to believe, maybe for the first time, that he was telling the truth. During the outing, Blake suggested a simple guessing game to make Chloe laugh. As Rachel watched them interact, she saw how genuine Blake was with her daughter. Chloe beamed, and with each smile from her, Rachel felt something inside her soften. It was as if the Blake she had once known, the arrogant, self-centered man, was slowly fading away, making room for someone more human. By the end of the day, when they were heading home, Chloe fell asleep in the backseat of the car. Blake, driving calmly, glanced at Rachel and said, "I know this was just one day, and it doesn't erase everything I've done. But I hope this can be the start of something new between us." Rachel took a deep breath, thinking of everything they had been through. "I can't promise it will be easy, Blake, but if you keep this up, maybe one day I can trust you again." Blake nodded, feeling a sense of gentle relief, a small light in the midst of a long darkness. He knew that Rachel's forgiveness would take time, and that their journey wouldn't be easy. But her words gave him hope. The weeks that followed were a gradual process of rediscovery. Rachel remained cautious, but slowly, the moments with Blake and Chloe began to fill her life with lightness. They began meeting regularly, and each day revealed more of the person Blake was striving to be. He shared simple plans, spoke about the volunteer work he had started doing with families in the city, and took a real interest in Chloe's school activities. Every small gesture, every patient step forward, showed Rachel that Blake was committed to becoming someone worthy of her trust again. And though the journey ahead was still uncertain, Rachel started to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they could rebuild what had once been broken. Rachel saw Blake's commitment to change, and it made all the difference. Despite the lingering hurt from the betrayal and the bet, Blake's consistent actions seemed to slowly ease the pain. He was becoming the father Chloe had always lacked and the man Rachel had longed for, even when she had once thought it impossible to find such a person. One calm evening, while they sat together at her house, Rachel felt it was time to speak the words she had been holding back since they had given their relationship a second chance. "Blake," she began, her voice uncertain, "I want you to know that it still hurts. What you did with the factory, the bet. It's not something easy to forget." Blake remained silent, waiting, his heart heavy. But Rachel continued, gathering her courage. "I believe you're changing, and despite everything, I'm willing to try again. But I need you to be honest from now on. I can't handle another disappointment. I can't let Chloe go through this again." Blake took her hand, feeling a rush of emotion. "Rachel, I promise, nothing will ever be like it was before. I'm here for both of you, and that will never change." She smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't total forgiveness, but it was a beginning, an opening for something new. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them with Blake, trusting that the man before her was truly committed to proving himself. The journey of rebuilding their relationship took time, built on every thoughtful conversation and every act of kindness. Weeks turned into months, and during that time, the bond grew stronger. Rachel still held on to some reservations, but Blake's constant support and sincere efforts to show he cared helped her trust him more with each passing day. Chloe, for her part, had already accepted Blake as a part of her life and showed how much she liked him. Over time, he became a solid father figure for her, someone she knew would always be there to support her, no matter what. The trust between Blake and Rachel deepened gradually. He respected her boundaries, never promising more than he could deliver. His commitment was demonstrated through his actions, his work with the support fund for former factory workers, his active involvement in Chloe's school activities, and his focus on projects that brought meaning to his life. As his conversations with Rachel became more genuine and honest, Blake finally felt peace with the simplicity he had once resisted. On a cold December evening, Blake invited Rachel and Chloe over for a Christmas dinner at his home. The house was much more modest now after he sold his company, but the warmth and peace in the air made the gathering feel special. Chloe, full of childlike joy, excitedly opened the first present, laughing and running around the house, while Blake and Rachel watched, smiling. Rachel looked at Blake, her heart full. "These months have been good, Blake. I think we've built something real, something I never thought could exist." Blake smiled back, squeezing her hand across the table. "Rachel, I've never been this happy. Everything I thought I needed has been replaced by this. By you, by Chloe, by our life together. Thank you for giving me this second chance." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she responded, her voice soft with emotion. "You've shown me that change is possible, Blake, and I believe that today you are the man who deserves to be by our side." That evening, they talked about the future, about simple dreams and plans for a life that would be meaningful in ways that truly mattered. Blake told her about a community project he was passionate about, something he wanted to start to help struggling families, inspired by everything he had learned from Rachel and Chloe. At the beginning of the new year, Blake took an unexpected step. He proposed to Rachel. This time, his intentions were clear and genuine. In a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by close friends and family, he asked for her hand in marriage, vowing with all his heart to be the partner and father that Chloe and Rachel deserved. As they exchanged vows, Blake knew with certainty that this commitment wasn't about pride or competition, but about love, pure, unselfish love. Rachel accepted his proposal, her eyes brimming with tears, knowing that after everything she had been through, She had finally found someone who truly understood and cherished her. She was ready to build a new life, freed from the shadows of the past and full of hope for the future. From that moment on, their lives were filled with small, joyful moments. Blake continued to work on his community project, while Rachel dedicated herself to supporting other women who, like her, had faced hardship. Chloe, surrounded by love and stability, grew up happy, knowing that she had a family who would always be there for her. 1 year after their wedding, Rachel and Blake received news that deeply moved them. They were expecting a baby. The joy they felt was overwhelming. For Blake, it was the realization of a dream he hadn't even dared to imagine. The moment he held his baby for the first time, tears of joy filled his eyes. Rachel, overcome with emotion, watched him hold the child with tenderness, knowing that their family was finally complete. Rachel knew, without a doubt, that after so much suffering, she was living the fresh start she had always dreamed of for herself, for Chloe, and now for the new child she shared with Blake. This life, built on sincerity and love, was everything she had ever wanted. And by Blake's side, she felt whole. Blake squeezed her hand and smiled. "Thank you for believing in me, Rachel, for giving me the chance to be a better person." She returned his smile. "Thank you for proving I was right to believe." As they walked together, united and complete, Blake understood that the bet, the pride, and the pursuit of money had been replaced by something infinitely more valuable, true love and the promise of a fresh start. Did Rachel do the right thing by forgiving and trusting Blake again? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinion. Your feedback is very important to us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more narratives like this. Thank you for watching.